As a boxing fan, you already know about the rivalry. You've seen the fights, and if you haven't, you should. Violent affairs, and each different, right? They fought each other at different points of their careers, and they told the story through their trilogy. Is what they did. But I want to take it a step further. I want to explain the rivalry. And what was it that made this rivalry real? It wasn't acting. It was genuine. But it was also venomous. This was not your typical two athletes with a big ego fighting for supremacy in a weight class. It was deeper than that. It wasn't about the machismo that HBO made it out to be. I'm not saying none of this played a role, but it was a lot deeper than that. You really got to go deep to explain why these guys genuinely hated one another. It is important to distinguish where both of these fighters are from. Marco Antonio Barrera was born in the capital, Mexico City, Mexico. Erik Morales was born in Tijuana, Baja California. Now, obviously, geographically, if you look at a map, two completely different places in the same country. Culturally, completely different place. Economically, completely different place. Marco Antonio Barrera had very good schooling, went on to become a lawyer. Erik Morales, humble beginnings, which much poorer, was brought up in a much poorer family than Marco Antonio Barrera. So it's important to understand that while they were born in the same country, they were from two completely different places. You need to understand, historically in boxing, in Mexican boxing, that this has changed a lot in recent years, especially as the popularity of the Mexican fighter started to grow, right? They're taking Mexican fighters and grooming them a lot differently now. But back in the day, you had to become the man in Mexico before you even entered the world stage. Julio Cesar Chavez was not exactly loved by all of Mexico when he was on a come up. When he was a prospect coming up, he wasn't quite loved by everybody. There were other regions in Mexico that had their guy in that division that they wanted to see go to the world stage, right? There was some animosity there. There was some hatred there. It was a rivalry. It was personal in a lot of sense. Now, once Chavez proved himself and proved he was the man and went on to the bigger stage, went on to win world titles, then yes, all of Mexico began to back him up. But the culture in Mexico was a lot different than the culture in Mexican-American culture, where Mexican-American fans just identify a fighter as Mexican, therefore I'm going to back him up. It's a lot different south of the border, right? The mentality is different because Mexico is a country they live in, but what they represent is the region where they're from, who they grow up around. Both these fighters in their collision course were already proven fighters. They had already conquered the national stage in Mexico. They were already in the world stage. But there was a perception. The perception was Erik Morales was on fire. He looked unstoppable. He was destroying opponents. Marco Antonio Barrera was still a top fighter in the division, but he had already reached his potential. He had already done what he was going to do in boxing. pretty much. Plus, if you looked at common opponents, right, Junior Jones had defeated Marco Antonio Barrera twice. Contrast that to Erik Morales, who defeated Junior Jones in very impressive fashion. The perception was Morales is on fire. He looks unstoppable in this division. Barrera's a good fighter, but I think we've seen all Barrera's going to do in boxing. That was the perception going in on paper. But there was a tactic used, and I do believe it was a tactic by Marco Antonio Barrera. It wasn't a hard tactic to use because I do feel that he was very genuine about how he felt. Very ugly, but both these men got very ugly with one another. It got very personal very quick. You could even argue it got out of hand. In my opinion, it did. It got very out of hand. It got very personal. These men did not care about the title at stake. At that point, it got personal. Marco Antonio Barrera called Erik Morales an ignorant Indian. Called him an indio. In case you're wondering, well, okay, what about it? Why did that make Morales so mad? Right? Well, when the Spaniards took over the Americas, right, what we now know as Mexico, you know, Central America, parts of South America, most of it, right? When the Spaniards took over, they created a class system. If you were a full-blooded Spaniard, you were first class. If you were mestizo, meaning mixed, you were second class. You were third class if you were a Native American, meaning an Indio. Barrera was basically telling Morales, you are below me. I'm upper class. You're lower class. Morales is very proud of where he's from. And it wasn't so much that he called him an Indian, but what the context was behind the way Barrera said it. Morales wasn't exactly an angel himself. Morales wore his heart on his sleeve. He felt like, how can this rich, spoiled brat possibly be as tough as me, as good as me, as hungry as me? He felt like I did it the hard way. That's the way he felt. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon in my mouth. He felt Barrera was nothing but a spoiled, rich punk. These two couldn't stand the sight of one another. While they were wearing three-piece suits at a press conference, posing for cameras, Marco Antonio Barrera couldn't stand the sight of Erik Morales. The sight of him irritated him so much that he sucker punched him in the face. They then proceeded to throw fisticuffs. Prize fighters fighting for free because they hated one another without gloves on. They had to break it up. This was true. This was venomous. What the word hate means, they hated one another. This was the true definition of hate. Erik Morales went into the boxing ring that night in their first fight with a chip on his shoulder. He wanted to prove something. He wanted to embarrass Marco Antonio Barrera, and Barrera wanted to do the same thing. Morales wanted to prove that this rich punk doesn't belong in the ring with me. He's an entitled punk, and I'm going to prove something. He went to the ring with that chip on his shoulder, and he wanted to prove I could beat him at his own game, and he went into a brawl with Marco Antonio Barrera. What resulted was the fight of the year, the fight of the decade, and one of the greatest fights of all time. It was a violent affair. Played right into Marco Antonio Barrera's hands. The role that Erik Morales was in, if Erik Morales would have fought a more technical fight, who's to say what would have happened? But I do honestly believe Morales would have won that fight handily. But what resulted was, although Morales got the nod, he took a lot of punishment in that fight. He got the nod, and a lot of pundits felt Barrera won the fight. I do feel a lot of that was because he was coming in as an underdog and did a lot better than expected. I think the fight is so hard to score for me personally. It's a very hard fight to score. It could go either way, to be honest. That first fight, it was a very violent affair. Visibly, Morales was never the same again. The fighter pre-Barrera was a dominating champion. Post-Barrera, still a very good champion, still one of the top fighters in the sport, but visibly no longer the same. Barrera, on the other hand, resurrected his career even in this controversial loss. In their second fight, which was still a slugfest, but a lot more technical than the first fight. I think this is where we began to see that now it was Barrera that wanted to prove I could be just as technical as you can. If you don't voluntarily slug it out with me like we did in the first fight, I'll fight your technical fight. And now it was Barrera trying to prove that he could fight Erik Morales' fight. It was a lot more technical, this fight. Another close fight. One of the HBO commentators even complained that the fight wasn't as violent as the first one. George Foreman was quoted during the telecast of that fight and saying, "That's when they were fools. Now they're millionaires." Heading into the third fight, Barrera was coming off a win against Ayala, but he had just gotten destroyed the year prior, late 2003. He had just gotten destroyed by Manny Pacquiao, who had just broken to the scene. Erik Morales was coming off victories over the likes of Jesus Chavez. But the public had questions about both these men and what they had left going into this third fight. They even questioned whether it was going to be even as good as the first two fights. Turned out to still be a great fight. It was still a good slugfest. Very technical in some respects still. High level boxing. Barrera ended up winning the majority decision in what I believe was the last round, if not the 11th, but I believe it was the last round. Morales should have been given credit for a knockdown, which the ref did not count. Barrera's gloves touched the canvas. But that's how close it was. If they would have counted that, Morales wins the trilogy. It was extremely close. That was the end of the trilogy, but not the end of the rivalry. In somewhat of a moral victory, Morales went on to defeat Manny Pacquiao right after this loss. Something that Marco Antonio Barrera never did. Just like in the Junior Jones case. Everybody thought Morales was finished, it was done. At least for that night, he proved everybody wrong. An amazing rivalry this was, wasn't it? Here are some things to take home. In a post-fight interview, Erik Morales was asked to admit that Marco Antonio Barrera was at his level, something Morales always said, he's not at my level. Morales proceeded to say, no, I'm not going to admit that. They tried to push the issue, asking, why can't you just admit it? Morales said, because I have something that you can't even understand. I have a thing called pride. It was evident both these fighters were talking trash to one another during the fight. Marco Antonio Barrera in a post-fight interview was asked, what was Erik Morales saying to you? Marco Antonio Barrera said, he was telling me que me la pelas. In a way of saying, you could suck my, you could fill in the blank. But basically what it means is, you're beneath me. You can't do shit to me. Before Erik Morales fought Manny Pacquiao, Marco Antonio Barrera was quoted in saying that he supports Erik Morales against a Filipino sensation because he wanted to support his fellow countryman, his fellow Mexican. Morales proceeded to respond to the media saying, I don't believe it. He didn't feel Marco Antonio Barrera was being genuine in any way, shape, or form. Before the rematch that Marco Antonio Barrera had with Manny Pacquiao, Erik Morales was interviewed, asked whether he still held a grudge towards Marco Antonio Barrera. Morales said, no. Que chingue su madre. Alright, that's what he said. Translation, no, I don't have any grudges. He will go fuck his mother for all I care. Basically what it means, he can go to hell for all I care. I don't even think about him. Pretty clearly, he still held a grudge. Do they still hold a grudge till this day? Hopefully not. But unfortunately, just like Frazier did with Ali for so many years, I think Erik Morales is going to carry this with him for the rest of his life because of his pride. But both their pride is what made this trilogy amazing, wasn't it? Salute to these two fighters. Salute to this great rivalry. And thank you very much for listening. Make sure you thumbs up the video.